Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I am, with indefatigable commitment to the cause of great conversation, your faithful friend and host, Daniel Finneran. Thank you so very much for joining me today. If, dear friend and listener and viewer, you find the conversations on this channel enlightening, entertaining, stimulating to the mind, or nourishing to the soul, please do consider subscribing. We're in the midst of growing a community of inquisitive minds, among which yours most certainly belongs. For content specific to mindfulness, wellness, literature, philosophy, and sleep, do consider visiting my sister project, Pneuma, Pneuma, by Daniel Finneran, to which I'll include a link in the show notes below. My guest today, with whom I'm absolutely ecstatic to have the opportunity to chat, is Martin Hogue. Martin is a licensed architect and landscape architect whose focus is on analytical drawings. He's an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at New York's prestigious Cornell University. Among his fields of interest, no pun intended, is the notion of a site as a cultural construction, an idea upon which I can't wait for Martin to dilate. Widely cited and published in a bunch of great academic journals, Martin's latest book, Making Camp, A Visual History of Camping's Most Essential Items and Activities, is available everywhere that fine books are sold. Martin, it's a pleasure and an honor to be joined by you today. Thank you so very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
As am I. And I want to begin with a hypothetical. Now, if you could select 3 people, and only 3, to accompany you on a 2-week-long camping trip, whom would you choose? These 3 people could be living, dead, famous, historically significant, obscure. Your choice is totally unconstrained. By whom would you want to be accompanied and why?
That's a great question. I would have to probably include individuals both living and dead. I think Horace Kephart would be a really wonderful individual who I just prepared a lecture on last week, and so I think he is known largely as revered as the Dean of American Camping. Was published this wonderful book, Camping and Woodcraft, like one of the kind of most important literary works on camping ever published. It's a considerably large book, about 900 pages long. I think he would be a wonderful guide. I would probably have to include some of the mentors, some of the individuals who have really supported me in my research on camping the last few years. My friend Terry Young, who lives in California, would be, I think, a wonderful friend to be on this journey. Also, I'm sure he would enjoy Kephart's company. And probably my wife Lori, who's been with me really every single camping trip that I've taken over the last 20 years. We've gone together, so I think we've experienced it, and we've shared a lot in our journey. So I think that would be a really pretty great trio.
I agree. I think without having met these people and read their works, it does seem like a good full group of 4. Now, I was thinking about this question the past day or two. My response is a little bit different. I chose Alexander the Great, Ernest Hemingway, and Gordon Ramsay.
Yeah.
And I did so for very specific reasons. I thought the vision of Alexander the Great would be helpful for 2 weeks, not for an entire 10 years of service. I thought Ernest Hemingway would be good just because of multitude of skills, his ability to hunt big game and also to memorialize what is happening, to write about it.
Yeah, you would have great stories too at the campfire. I'm sure.
Exactly, and that's the other point I was just about to make. The stories around the campfire would be
quite
extraordinary. So Hemingway, and also the fishing abilities if we were near some water. and then Gordon Ramsay for the preparation of those big game catches. So those would be my three. Oh gosh. And then I thought of some fictional characters. What about that? Could you think of a couple fictional characters from literature or from film?
Oh
By
boy,
whom you want to be accompanied?
that's really a difficult one. I may have to think about that one a little bit longer. But no, that's a great question. I mean, there's so few films that feature camping that I think that's I teach a lot of film related classes, so I'm always keeping lists on various topics related to landscape and buildings and cities, and I have a list going on sort of camping films where camping is, and the list is rather short, so I think that would be, I would have to think about that one a little bit longer.
Maybe John Candy from The Great Outdoors.
Sure. and a celebrated Canadian, so that would be maybe
doubly fitting. Yeah. When I think of this question, I think in response, maybe Huckleberry Finn. I think Huckleberry Finn would be just an excellent camping companion. It might get us into some trouble, but overall, I think that he'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, and I have here your book, to which I'll be making some references, and I know you do as well. The more recent photographs in your book, those dating from the 1960s on,
yeah,
they disabused me of the romantic notions that I had of camping. When I think of camping in its truest and its purest sense, I think an image like this one, if you can see it, on page 47.
Yep.
I think of the hikers I passed by when I was trekking on Mount Mitchell in North Carolina a couple of years ago, who sort of had this spirit about them. They just found an open spot and set up their tents and all their paraphernalia and set out to it. But then I turned to page 17 of your book, at the bottom of which is a group of, if you can see it, a group of sedentary, unhappy, mostly overweight people sitting in lawn chairs in a circular formation around what seems to be a sacred box of Ritz crackers, which for you watching without the book, you can't quite see, but it's right there in the center. I
think it's very intentional that the Ritz are right in the center of that.
And part. I think so as well. So talk to me a little bit about this incongruity between the ideal of camping, the ruggedness, the intimate connection with nature, the fierce independence, and the somewhat decadent reality of which I think glamping or glamorous camping is the prime example.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great. I think the selection of these two photographs is hits the kind of tone or the ambition of this book really, really well. That, I mean, for me, I got interested in camping not as with my first camping check-in experience about over 20 years ago, when I arrived at this campground and I was given a map. I was really taken aback by this idea. I thought I had imagined in my mind, I'm not exactly sure what I thought was going to happen, but I thought I might be directed to an open field at the edge of a woods and say, go find a spot for yourself. And instead, having this map and the attendant using a highlighter to prescribe a very specific campsite where I should go and set up my tent and a sleeping bag that a friend of mine had lent me for the summer. And I think what I realized a few years later is that there was a real disconnect between what I thought was going to happen, which I think is the first image you pointed to, a kind of an image in my mind of backwood adventurers from the 19th century, right, creating the camp from scratch out of bark and branches and fallen trees, and then the kind of reality on the ground, which was a series of cars parked at their individual campsites, people grilling, lawn chairs. And so for me, the scope of this book has been about figuring out in a way what changed, what the kind of history of the transformation between these two images that you pointed to, I think is exactly right. That the idea is the same, but the physical landscape where these experiences take place is entirely different. And that's been sort of the ambition of the book. And for me, I think I like camping, but I'm actually not like an enthusiast who will set out, every Friday night. We don't head out every Friday, like friends of mine, say, Terry, one of my three companions who might be on this hypothetical trip every Friday will head out on a camping journey. I like to think about camping. When I'm camping, I like to observe my settings. I like to observe other people. And in a way, that's what's fueled a little bit the kind of direction of this book. It's a serious book, but it's also a little bit tongue-in-cheek in terms of acknowledging the kind of the character of the physical setting where these experiences now take place. That if you glance at your neighbor even for a second, that fantasy that we all entertain in our minds kind of falls apart. And I like that idea. I'm intrigued by that idea, and I think that's what. But it all started with this map.
You're something of a philosophical camper. You're like a Kantian camper.
Sure. No, I mean, I'm interested in observing as much as I am in experiencing it for ourselves, for myself. But I think it's but I think as an architect the one thing I would correct in your introduction is I'm a licensed architect, but I'm a trained in landscape architecture. I'm not a professional landscape architect, but I am interested in physical settings, and I think for me, campgrounds are very much part of that kind of range of places that I like to think about in my work.
Absolutely. So you're something of a metacognitive camper. When you are in the act of camping, you're thinking about the act of camping.
Yes, of course. I think that's a really good point. But it's one who's, I'm going to say, is kind of aware of some of the ironies and who's leaning into those and trying to understand them. So I want to think that the book is it's both very serious, in terms of understanding the evolution of the setting or the different pieces of gear. But it's also one that, I had so much fun writing this book, and I hope that comes across in some way, that there's a little bit of kind of tongue-in-cheek, here and there, where some of these photographs that you showed, that Bruce Davidson photographs in the 1960s, for me, capture exactly kind of some of the discomfort that I experienced on my first trip, and when I saw his images, I knew there were other like-minded people in the world who had been intrigued by similar questions or situations.
I think that irony is very rich. I think that it is detectable.
Sure.
By all close readers, and it makes it a very enjoyable read. Like you said, it is a serious book in that, you are enumerating, as we will get into, the most essential features of camping, but also contrasting them as they were maybe originally intended to be put to use, and as they are today. So it's really interesting in that regard. But let me focus in on just something you said. I had this planned, and it's appropriate that you said it now. In the afterword to your book, you admit, and you admitted just now with refreshing candor, that you haven't, quote, come to really enjoy and love camping all that much. Now, you describe yourself as having felt like you were an actor in or a spectator to a series of tightly defined scenes, almost as though you were, in a narrative work. You say that each script changes very little from one campground to the next. So maybe short of totally immersing yourself in the fertile bosom of nature, like Henry David Thoreau or John Muir, what do you think you could do to feel less like an actor or a spectator in your approach toward nature and camping sites?
I will say that my wife and I have had wonderful camping experiences. So I think I'm maybe articulating a kind of broader point about my own motivations behind this work, but we've had many very satisfying trips. I think that many of the most satisfying trips have been oftentimes in areas where campgrounds may not have been as busy, or where we've had to walk into a campsite sort of from a from a parking area, so a little bit more remote. But so there have been many very satisfying experiences. I mean, that's absolutely true. Again, the larger arc remains that I think what interests me about this has been to understand this disconnect that we experience. I think the question of scale is one that I think is really important in this book, that as camping has grown in popularity, we've had to develop infrastructure, and campgrounds are part of that allow large numbers of people to take part in that experience. And as campgrounds scale up, become larger, denser, more populated, along with that comes that challenge of the authenticity of that experience kind of changes with that at the same time.
Right. And as a camper, you want to experience a certain intimacy with your natural surroundings, but yet you find yourself, stacked in a very commercial-like way.
Sure. Yeah.
In your little plot. It's almost like when you go to the butcher and you're given a ticket and you're waiting your order. It's somewhat similar to that.
I mean, I like the irony too, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, that I think a group that may have vacated a campsite in the morning, will be replaced by an entirely different group maybe a couple hours later. So there's a kind of constant flow of people in and out of the campground, and those groups will remain forever unknown to one another. But there's a kind of, when you arrive at that plot, the emptiness of the plot suggests a kind of, that it's a freshly discovered place. But I think there's a really interesting relationship between the elements that are there, some of the furnishings that are there, like the fire pit or the picnic table and so on, that suggest kind of what's going to happen there, but it's not so fully developed that there's not a space for each camper to create, to have a certain sense of agency and developing their encampment. So they're still part of the role is still ours to play in this entire process, to build our own tent, to cook our own meal. And so there's still, in some ways, some connection to that initial idea of what it was like, what it would have been like to be camping out in the wilds of the Adirondacks, 150 years ago or so.
Do you ever find yourself crafting a fictionalized narrative of the people who came before you?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say one of the reasons, one of the roles or the visions I had for this book was that it's something that could be brought. It's not something that would be read in your house or your apartment, but at the campsite. And so it's one that is meant to bring some of these characters directly at the campground with you. And so over a meal or over the light of the campfire, you pull it out of your bag and you start reading. So it's a kind of piece of gear in itself, and it's a companion. It's one that helps to bring comfort, presence, context to what that experience is about. I think, at least was how I thought about the book initially.
My expectation is that this book will be at least temporarily brought to a multitude of campsites. And
I hope so.
That
would be great. That's what it's meant to be.
And your literary footprint will have stamped every plot across this beautiful land.
It's even meant, I mean, my first book was a quite large book. It was kind of 12 by 12. This one is meant, its size to kind of, that was a really deliberate question that we tackled a few years ago when we were designing the book, that it was meant to, be a much more, it was meant to be a piece of gear. It was meant to be something that was easy to carry and to move around. It's not a coffee table book.
Yeah, and I think you and the publishers and the people behind the production of this book succeed in that attempt. I do want to talk about the design of the book a little bit more, but just for a little while longer, I want to focus on that disconnect that you mentioned people feel. Now, when you're at a campsite, as you are philosophizing about camping, do you ever actually engage with people and ask them about this disconnect? Or do you fear that maybe by revealing it, you might perhaps hamper the good time that they're having?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been an artist in residence at a small art park outside of Syracuse at the Stone Quarry Hill Art Park the last several years, and I was asked to contribute an artwork there first in 2017, and I proposed that to turn the art park into a campground. And so on this campground every summer for 4 weekends every summer, there are 4 dedicated campsites that are temporarily created there that allow visitors of the art park to kind of live in the art park for 48 hours, right, and really appreciate the art there in a completely different way. And I think so. I fancy myself in that aspect, at least as a campground manager myself. Like I don't just write about it, but I'm actually the host of that experience over those 4 weekends, and I've had derived so much satisfaction from engaging with the visitors to the art park and to the campground in that capacity and that role. And so I think that would be the one moment I think where I see it as part of my responsibility to kind of orient people to the art park, to the project, to the facilities that I've created temporarily around the art park. And so in that role, yes, I love kind of meeting people, talking to them about my work, about their expectations, and finding some common ground there. That's been a really satisfying experience for the last. We've done 5 editions of that project now, and it's every weekend, every year is always different people. Some come back, but it's just always a pleasure to kind of get to know people around that project.
And through your interactions with this diversity of people, have you found that the majority prefers, or at least aspires to, that rugged individualism, the ideal that we discussed? Or do you think that a lot of people are more content with the more relaxed, well, I shouldn't say relaxed, the more structured, I would say, almost decadent reality that we face? What do you think, having engaged with some of these people?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that even kind of in the early decades of recreational camping in the 19th century, this notion of comfort has always been central to that experience. And so it's not a reflection of the modern society that we live in now. Even in the early beginnings of recreational camping, people were reluctant in some ways to leave behind some of the comforts that they enjoyed at home. And it's been this sort of that ability to entertain both sides of that experience, where you're both enjoying that kind of ruggedness of the landscape, of the settings, without entirely sacrificing those comforts, that I find really interesting. So I think that's always been a central question in recreational camping in general, and one that seems to be accelerating in some ways now with the kind of proliferation of gear and RVs and so on and so forth. But it's always been there in some ways.
I have a tendency of perhaps trying to derive more meaning from things than perhaps exist. So you'll have to excuse me for that. But do you think that this trend speaks to something a little bit deeper in our culture? This movement away from that rugged individualism of our forefathers and you, our forebears. And of course, they did have their comforts, but they were very different comforts from those that we enjoy today, that they enjoyed in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and the early 20th century. Or have we just become, through affluence and age, decadent old folk? I guess what I'm doing is almost using camping as a microcosm through which to view the rest of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong to do so? Or do you sense maybe that there is something to that?
I mean, I will say that I think there is not a single type of camper. So people have different expectations, and when they head out, there are people who will um, head out into a United States national forest and set up their campsites really in a kind of completely spontaneous, kind of rustic way. And there are people who park in Walmart parking lots and who overnight there. So it is impossible to kind of identify a single idea of what people expect or think about when they go camping. And so in that respect, my book maybe takes the more extreme position of looking at the proliferation of those comforts. But I think I've run into, I've talked to a lot of people who will refuse to camp in a large national park campground because it's far too developed for them, right? So it's really impossible to kind of summarize that experience to a single standard.
I see.
I think.
Yeah, and in your book, actually, you mentioned the fact that one of the modern iterations of camping is what you just described, is people actually parking in a Walmart parking lot. So it just really highlights the array of ways in which you can technically be camping. So it's not, you don't have to be a purist, as I kind of described it earlier in my idealized version of just having basically the clothes on your back, a tent, and a bow and arrow. It doesn't have to be this sort of Arcadian vision of a pre-modern experience. It can be setting up overnight in that Walmart parking lot. I know I see that even around the town in which I live. I see, especially in one area, a man with a small little trailer in which he occasionally sleeps. And I don't see it there every night. I don't think he's homeless, but to me, it's sort of like this interesting, different way of camping, if I can think of it in that way. Of course, he might not. It might, for him, be a desperate measure that he's taking in order to stave off the elements and to protect himself. But
yeah, I mean, I think that's a broader conversation, and I've tried to limit sort of my thinking here to camping for recreational purposes, right? So it's quite a very deliberate decision that we make to actually seek that experience out. I think when it comes to us in these unfortunate ways, I think we're really in a really different place, even though, so this has been a kind of book about the more traditional idea of really voluntarily kind of seeking out. But I do think that if even if you find yourself into some of these more developed or more heavily developed campgrounds across the country, that the campsite can act as a kind of base, as a home base from which one can head out into the broader expanse of the park for hikes and other activities that could be far more rewarding in some ways. I think the campsite then becomes a kind of home base at which you're not spending necessarily that much time, but you are returning to it nightly or daily, right, for your meals or for other activities. And so it's not to say that one goes to that spot and kind of stays there for the duration of their trip either.
This might be leading us a little bit off the path of the conversation, which I think we're fruitfully set out. But I mentioned in my introduction, one of your areas of study is the notion of site as cultural construction. Can you perhaps expand on this idea for us?
Yes, I think to me, the idea of camping and the campsite, if you separate that word, is a site where the reenactment of some of these activities are taking place, although the site itself has been created before any group of camper arrives at that place. And I think that's a very different idea than in the 19th century, where that entire site was created from scratch by the individuals who occupied that particular place. And so for me, as an architect, as a designer, we place a lot of agency in the role of a site in informing our work. As an architect, you often think about a site as something that exists but will be supplanted by a building. Once the building is constructed, the site itself is no longer there. It's being replaced in some way by a structure. I think in landscape architecture, we maybe approach things a little bit differently, where the kind of, but for me, a site is a designation. It's, if we're walking down the street and I could point to you, this is the site where my bicycle was stolen last year. That place exists in my mind as kind of linking a place and an event. For other individuals, that same site does not exist. It doesn't have the same kinds of qualities or associations. So for me, the site is first and foremost a designation. It's something that intellectually we assign meaning to a specific place. And I think that's what drew me to camping as well, is that we've set up an infrastructure where all of these multiple sites exist for us to fill them up with our experiences, with our activities, with our labor, to imagine ourselves as being rugged backwood adventurers, at least in some cases.
Martin, you truly are a philosophical architect camper.
I mean, I think all architects are.
Is that now? You're the first outside George Costanza from Seinfeld. I think you're the first true architect that I've paid much attention to now, yeah. and had the good opportunity to talk with. Is that a common way of thinking in the architectural world? Because you're almost talking about, I don't know, the metaphysics of sites and locations. There's something very profound about what you're saying. And I think intuitively, a lot of people can feel that way. Like if a site carries with it some grave significance, whether good or bad, it of course is meaningful to a very different extent and on a very different level. But we don't really articulate that. But you're talking about something that's very subtle and very powerful. So that philosophical view, is that something that I think that is unique to you, or is it sort of inculcated as you are pursuing the career of an architect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question too. I will say that for me, one of the reasons why I started to think about sites, not necessarily the kind of buildings that we put on those sites, explains in part the reason why I started out as more formal training as an architect and moved into landscape architecture in some ways, that I became more interested in the places than in the kind of constructions that we put on those places. And it's been informed by a number of peers and artists and other sort of individuals and whose work has really helped me to shape that perspective. One of the individuals that I often think about that's really important in my own education and sort of career as an architect is an architect who was trained at Cornell, also Gordon Matta-Clark, who came out of Cornell in the 1960s and became a really productive, important artist in New York City in the 70s. And one of the projects I always love to think about, and that's really shaped my own work, is he discovered a series of residual properties that were put up for auction in the borough of Queens. These are lots like 100, like 1 foot wide by 100 foot long, like all of these weird sort of tiny properties around Queens. And he bought many of them at auction for $25 a piece. And to me, this project was a revelation. Like, it was something about an architect, and he called these the fake estates. So they're real estate, they're pieces of real estate, but they're fake in the sense that they don't support the kind of architectural thinking that would normally be connected to a piece of property, like let's put a building on top of it. And that project really changed my whole outlook on what I should be doing with my architectural training. And so I want to think that the camping book, in a way, is a little bit paying homage to that project, that these are little bits of land, these campsites, that kind of play a role in helping us reenact some of these kinds of connections to these backwood adventures. But I really love that project in a way that, again, starts to explain how I could go from a traditional architectural practice and training into something a little bit more meta, into something that really looks at properties, at pieces of land in the city, but in a way that's kind of unexpected, that it leads you to find these weird anomalies that exist in the city, and to say, these are real, and my role is to show you that they exist. I'm going to document, photograph them, find maps where they exist, and really kind of bring them to our attention.
It's interesting to think that you had this formative experience with a professor whose work was focused in the city, in a highly urbanized environment.
He was not a professor of mine, but he was an artist whose work is as kind of, the discovery of that work has shaped my own.
I see.
My own work. Yeah.
I see. I would just draw the interesting contrast between the work to which his career was devoted, in that highly urbanized setting, and that to which yours is currently devoted, which is quite the contrary, the complete opposite. You took these profound lessons from his work,
yep,
and are now applying them to a totally different terrain.
Right.
Maybe you can comment on that a little bit. How does one cross that bridge from the highly urbanized to the highly bucolic?
Yeah, that is, I think, maybe, again, when I first checked into that campground, the instinct that I had when I got that map was something akin to what I experienced when I first saw the Fake Estates project. Like, I couldn't articulate it fully at that particular point, but in my mind, it's not so much that it's urban or rural, but more that we are designated through these representations of the landscape, through these maps, the existence of these kinds of parcels. And so that's maybe goes back to that idea of site. Like, a site is a designation, and by confirming the existence of these residual lots on a map, as he did, and what I'm doing with the campsites on a map, like circling with a highlighter, you're going to be camping at site number 113 tonight. There's a kind of parallel there that spans time, it spans geography, but it's not so much a kind of urban versus rural. I mean, there are many campsites or camping experiences, I think, historically in the 1920s, where people camped in cities. Almost every city, there were about 2,000 cities across the country that had a municipal campground. At the edge of town, it could be a baseball field or a kind of semi-open field. The idea was to capture people as they were traveling across the country, to have them buy gas and food and supplies in their towns. And so there were moments where camping was quite urban. And if you look at, KOA franchises now, they're often peri-urban. They're at the edge of cities, at the edge of highways. And so we're not necessarily kind of creating this oppositional, like, you live in a city, you camp in the wilderness. Like, there are conditions that are on a gradient here that are much more, they're sitting somewhere in between those two ideals.
Right. So they don't have to be so starkly discrete.
Not necessarily, right.
The trouble is, I suppose nowadays, when you think of urban camping, you think of vagrancy. You think of San Francisco, which is overrun by tents, but these are people not camping recreationally, as we described earlier. These are people camping out of necessity or because of availability.
Well, I mean, I think these are extremely serious problems that this book does not tackle. I think it's, but it's one that I think these are, I mean, and so I'm hesitant to take that on because I think I wanted to reserve this particular study to the kind of this recreational aspect of camping for pleasure.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I just, it's lamentable, of course, and I hope that we see another day, a brighter day, when what you just described is possible again. Because well, I can't imagine. The last city to which I went was New Orleans, America's little French city, and there was a lot of homelessness. There were a lot of tents that I saw under byways, and I can't imagine an open field being sort of preserved for passersby who are traveling to stop there and camp without it being overrun. So that's a totally different subject that your book, of course, does not address. But it just kind of has me wondering right now, and I hope that what you just described is possible again, where people can go.
I might extend that the idea of that. I think even the ability to enjoy the experience of camping is unfortunately at the moment not available to all. That I think it takes a lot of gear, it takes a lot of equipment. Equipment is expensive. Campgrounds or great campgrounds, great landscapes are often outside of cities, so it takes transportation. There's a competitive nature to reserving good campsites. I think oftentimes now you have to reserve months in advance of even arriving at the campground. You have to reserve your spot. So high-speed internet, all of that infrastructure is not available to all. So I think that idea that campgrounds even represent what America looks like, it is not true, right? It is not a representation of who we are as a country, of all people, and so all peoples. And so I think there are, in that idea of enjoying nature, of being out there, it is a privilege. And it is not an opportunity that is available to all. So I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to occur on that end to kind of make it even more democratic and even more available to everyone.
Yeah, and it's disheartening to reflect on that. This is one pursuit, one hobby, one recreation that should be egalitarian. Like you said, it should be absolutely democratic. We all should have access to nature in some small way, perhaps, but certainly on the grander scales, we want that for all. And it becomes, like you said, cost prohibitive with all those expenses that quickly accumulate. And flipping through your book, you can see the way in which the technology has advanced. Just taking for a simple example, the way in which we cook our food. There's an image of this solar panel, very green contraption that I'm sure is quite expensive. I think it started as a Kickstarter or a crowd-funded type device. But you can see how advanced things become and how necessarily expensive they can become. So like you said, it is somewhat cost prohibitive for a lot of people. And hopefully there are still avenues to pursue this hobby, this pastime, that are a little bit less expensive and open to all. Now, I mentioned that this book is a visual history, and it's a delightfully visual history of camping. What is your favorite image in this book? Now, sadly, I can't show everybody, clearly enough the images that adorn it, but they're all in black and white.
Mm-hmm.
There are photographs spanning from the late 19th century all the way up to the modern day. There are sketches, beautiful sketches, especially by the hand of one Albert Good, about whom I want to talk in a couple minutes. So there are a variety of images. What is your favorite?
Well, I mean, I will say that as an architect, I'm a visual thinker. So I think I'm surrounded by drawings, diagrams, sketches all the time. And so that's how I see the world. That's how I think about the world. So it seemed appropriate in this book to kind of balance out the kind of written narrative and the visual storytelling, the potential of these images to kind of tell the story. There are, for the hundreds of images that are in the book, there are hundreds more that did not make it in. So, for me, the process of research oftentimes starts with the images, and in a way, the story is written around is a way to connect the images to one another. The favorite would be, I mean, I think some of these Albert Good images, who is an architect who was hired by the Park Service in the 1930s to produce a kind of a compendium of design standards for for campgrounds and other recreational facilities in state parks and national parks. those would have to be, I mean, those books there that were published in the 30s are absolute touchstones in the project. There are several images or drawings included throughout the book. I think those are probably my favorite if I had to pick. I don't know that it'd be one image inside of the book, but I think the beauty, the execution of those drawings, no architect can be insensitive to that kind of incredible craft. I mean, they're truly spectacular.
Nor can the layman like myself. I was totally arrested by how elegant
Mhm.
and quite beautiful these drawings are. And of course, I encourage everybody listening or
Mhm.
watching this video to pick yourself up a copy, because the imagery is just astonishing. Can you, since we've mentioned his name twice now, can you tell us a little bit more about Mr. Good, Mr. Albert Good, who he was, and why we
Yeah,
should perhaps be a little bit more familiar with him?
sure. I mean, I don't, there's not a lot that I know about him. What I do know is that he was an architect in Cleveland, and during the Depression was hired by the Park Service as a consultant to essentially travel the country and to document recreational campgrounds and other facilities that were being developed at the time in national parks and state parks. And so the record that he assembled, and there were two editions of this book, and during the 1930s. And I think that record, really interestingly for me, was not just a documentation of things that were being done around the country, like how to build a fire pit, how to build a picnic table, and so on, but became kind of design standards on their own that were proliferated around their country, and in a way explains or helps explain the way or the reason why so many campgrounds look similar to one another. That it was through really his work that those standards were being disseminated across the country.
Right. So he basically created, in many regards, the standards
Yeah, but
upon
yeah,
which all other
yeah.
campsites were based.
Well, and the publication of these books and then starting to share those across the country, everybody had those books. So when they were designing state parks in Idaho or elsewhere, they were using some of Good's work, right? And so this starts to explain why, when we travel from one state to another, many of the standards will be the same. That's really as a result of his considerable influence.
Yeah. And when one thinks of the multitude of people that will come and go through a park during
Mhm.
just a single year, it's astonishing to think that there's this great unacknowledged debt of gratitude that should be paid to a designer like Albert Good,
Yeah.
to whom
But I
we'll
don't
probably.
think Good was a camper. I mean, at least from what I can glean of his work, I don't think he was. He was an architect first and foremost, and I think that's important to acknowledge that campgrounds are architectural in some ways, right, in terms of their setting. And so I'm really proud of the fact to be an architect, but also to have that kind of connection that another architect, 80 years later is able to kind of come in, and I want to think in some way extend the legacy of Good. I mean, that's a big ambition, probably far beyond my own abilities, but
No,
one
no,
that is
no.
able to update, some of the
I
thinking.
I disagree. I think it's well within your ability, and you succeeded in doing so. Just take, for instance, yours truly, the man to whom you're talking right now.
Mhm.
I had never known of Albert Good prior to this, prior to reading this book, and now I'm struck by him. Like you said, there's not a lot of information about his life. If you try to research him, I don't even think he has a Wikipedia page. It's almost as though he never existed if you don't have a Wikipedia page. So there's not a lot to be found, and you succeeded brilliantly in preserving his memory, and his more than his memory, his drawings, of which I'd like to show maybe just two. If I hope that they come through clearly on the
Yep.
camera. So if you can see that, that is a depiction or a blueprint of the camp fire site. And you can see, hopefully, just how fine the lines are drawn, how finely they're drawn, how exact the measurements are. I mean, it's absolutely, from an architectural standpoint, I think, impressive, but just from an artistic point of view as well, really
So all of the text
quite lovely.
is written by hand. So there's a kind of incredible craft and the handwritten notes across throughout the book. And all of Good's drawings were also in grayscale and black and white. So there's another kind of parallel there between the my own book, which is all in grayscale, and
Yeah.
the kind of beautiful minimalism of these. But every note, every label here is all handwritten. It's just beautifully executed.
Yeah. And as someone who takes a small amount of pride in his penmanship,
Mhm.
I was very impressed by the
Oh,
way in which it's written. The font
astonishing.
is just gorgeous, and to think
Mhm.
that a man could do this freehand without the help of a typewriter is
Mhm.
extraordinary, especially today when we could go weeks without writing anything physically. We type and tap and swipe and hardly have any need for that sort of meticulous care
Mhm.
in communicating our ideas, whether they
Right.
be visual or words, pictorial or verbal in a sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, for those listening and watching, please get yourself a copy, because just looking at the way in which he draws a grill or a stage or a campground in its totality is just absolutely stunning. Now, are there any other big names in the history of campsite development with which we should be familiar?
I think those stand. His name stands above all others. I think, in my view, there are other similar books that were being published at around the same period of time where campgrounds were starting to acquire this more structured kind of quality. But I think all of those books, if you look closely, are all informed by Good's work also. So in that sense, I think he. I guess I might say another individual who has been profoundly influential, Emilio Meineke, who is another individual who, at the end of the 1920s and 30s, really started to codify the impact of the motor vehicle in natural settings. And so he's the first to become extremely worried about the impact that vehicles like, leaking oil and vehicles moving around a campground, crushing shrubs and tearing off barks off of trees. Like, he was the first to really start to propose these one-way loop roads and parking spurs that are so common now in campsite design. So Meineke and Good are the two most important figures at this sort of early design stage of campgrounds.
Emilio Meineke, is he perhaps the namesake of the Meineke company?
I am not sure. I mean, information on Meineke is maybe a bit scarce also, but it's was a plant pathologist for the was hired as a consultant for the Park Service to kind of investigate the negative impact of motor vehicles in these campgrounds, which at first were just big open fields where you can park and sort of aggregate. But he quickly started to realize that these were causing a lot of problems. And so, extremely important figure, but one that is kind of drafted a few memos that became really crucial in the development of campgrounds. And Good is one who really started to formulate the whole array of structures that we encounter, like toilets and fire pits and campsites and the whole range of piers on lake fronts and so on. All of that infrastructure is one that we owe to Albert Good, I think.
Yeah, and his services will be acknowledged on this channel. That's for sure.
There's, I think a really quick trip to, I think, archive.org has wonderful PDFs of both editions of those books available. And so if someone is interested in just taking a quick look, hundreds of pages, each one more beautiful than the previous. It's quite a beautiful experience to just flip through those books, I think.
Yeah, and they're so beautiful, as I said, and hopefully as I showed. One would be tempted even to put them on his or her wall as artwork. That's
Mhm.
how gorgeously they are
Yes.
created, how they are crafted.
Yeah.
Now, your book encompasses the 8 most significant features of camping. They are water, the campfire, the campsite, the map, the picnic table, the tent, the sleeping bag, and trash. Which of the 8 was most interesting for you to research and write about, and why?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I will say that when I first wrote the chapter on the picnic table, so I had thought about campsites for maybe as a designer for 15 years. I've been researching the history of the campsite. It's after the picnic table, writing a single essay on the picnic table, because I was really curious to know the origins of that element that's so ubiquitous in our landscape, right? It's not just we don't encounter them only at campgrounds or campsites. They're everywhere. It's after writing that particular essay that I started to realize maybe there was a methodology that I could start to apply to other important components of the campsite or the camping experience. So I would say that one is pretty crucial in the kind of starting to realize that there was a book here to be written.
Yeah.
But
So the
every chapter is super fun. I mean, it was individually, like I was never writing 2 at once. I was finishing an entire essay before I could move on to the next. So each one was really captivating in its own right.
Yeah, just to demonstrate the ubiquity and the various uses of the picnic table. You know, you have it depicted in film.
At the bottom. Yep.
Yeah, and then also in the high stakes political conversation between 2 former high-ranking officials in our nation's government. And then we contrast that to what I think is my favorite image, excluding all of the great designs by Albert Good.
Yeah.
Perhaps my favorite image is this one here, if you can see it. And that is from, let me get the date, from 1886.
Yeah.
And it shows this beautiful but crude picnic table. The 2 men seated at it are impeccably dressed, at least in black and white. They have their hats on. The one gentleman is seated with absolutely perfect posture as he looks down at his meal in front of him, and likewise the other man in front of him is doing the same. In the background of which there are men preparing the food and ladling and finishing the meal. That to me, I think, is the finest image in the entire book. And again, it's the picnic table as you just described. So
right.
Perhaps,
well, it's a structure developed to accommodate seating. I think it shows, I think the evolution of that to some of the more common structures that we now know to be picnic tables is the evolution of that need to be able to sit at our campsite that has really been transformed over time into a kind of object, a commodity that we often build in a shop or will bring to the campsite, whereas the picnic table you were referring to is one that's really built in and from the campsite itself, from materials that were found, trees that were fallen in or near the campsite. So it's a very, very different kind of connection to that activity of seating.
Do you think our collective romanticization of and fascination with the picnic table bespeaks our fundamental communal nature as human beings? Because what is it? It's the table around which everyone, or at which everyone sits to consume a meal, to pass stories, right? Do you think that is the reason why it's so compelling a feature of campsites?
Yeah, I know. I would agree. I think there is absolutely a kind of social dimension to that experience. Yes.
So speaking of the picnic table, let's talk about what is served on that picnic table. Tell me, what is the best campsite meal that you've personally ever consumed?
I can think of many. I think a few in Acadia National Park, we were able to kind of grill some seafood scallops, I think, that we'd found at a local market, brought back with us to our campsite. So there's a few meals that really stand out as uniquely. I guess I will say that I think any meal prepared at a campsite feels, to me, it tastes better than if you were to cook the exact same meal in your kitchen at home. There's a kind of overcoming, big quotes here, some of the challenges, lighting a fire, maintaining the campfire, cooking, that seems to make all of those meals uniquely tasty.
I think there's something similar about the grill in the early days of summer.
Sure.
I remember as a child, whenever the grill was turned on, and it wasn't regularly turned on in our in our house or outside our house, but when it was, there was always an indescribable quality about a properly grilled or an improperly grilled steak. There's just that essence to it that is uncaptured by anything that you could ever order or cook indoors.
Yep.
And let me ask you, if you could devise a menu for a camping meal for your wife and Horace Kephart and some of the other people that you would be accompanied by, what would you serve? What would be your ideal meal?
Wow, that is a tough question. I was recently, I gave a small lecture maybe a month and a half ago, where this young woman asked me about if I knew anything about the history of s'mores, and it sent me on this wild goose chase to figure out just where s'mores had originated from. And I was so impressed with that insight that I'd given a lecture about the campfire, the history of the fire and cooking, and she asking about s'mores. It was such a delightful question that I think it sent me on like a 1-week research project to figure out.
So we're all wondering, what were the fruits of that research?
No, it was great. I mean, I think there's some ambiguity.
What is the history of the s'more?
There's some ambiguity, as there always are, but there are some cookbooks from the early 1920s, 1910s, from the Girl Scouts that refer to this new treat that is being produced at the campfire. But we know that the graham cracker, the marshmallow are inventions that really predate this particular period. But I think the first published mention of the name, like s'mores or s'mores, is actually a little bit later than the first published recipes for that treat, which were kind of known by other names before. But I would say it's around that kind of period of time. But I thought that was such a wonderful question to be asked. That was like, I mean, to me, camping and s'mores are always connected, but for somebody to ask that, I thought was so great. And it was a really wonderful research project to try to answer her question.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the two are just synonymous. A campsite is hardly complete without a s'more. And maybe that would have been the 9th feature if you could extend your book or perhaps produce a sequel. An history of the s'more would, I think, be appropriate for a work such as yours. So around what time was that? You mentioned it was sort of the Girl Scouts. In what area and around what time?
I would say 1910s, 1920s. Again, the graham cracker exists before that time, and marshmallow is actually the treat itself, even though we think of it as a kind of mass-produced commodity now, really exists centuries ago. Like, it only became a confection, like a kind of candy or treat, in the 19th century. So it's kind of interesting that the chocolate, the marshmallow, and the graham cracker are all eyeing one another and somehow find a way to kind of meet right around the campfire. But it's really through cookbooks that those first practices or the recipe for the s'mores was formulated, at least to the best of my knowledge, as things go. That could change. I haven't given up on researching that further, but from what I know now, around that period.
Fascinating. It's just one of those perfect American foods. The s'mores, the cheeseburger, the hot dogs, things like that.
They're all If it's a sandwich, it's a sandwich, and so they're all.
Yeah. I guess that's it. And sandwich etymologically goes back to the Earl of Sandwich, who was a British aristocrat during the colonial period. So that's why I love America. Like, you look at the s'more. What is it? Like you said, it's a graham cracker. Well, named after, who was it? Sylvester Graham.
Yeah.
Who created these foods that were basically supposed to dampen the sexual urge. So,
Yeah.
it's a strange kind of a history. And then I've always been fascinated by marshmallow, because we call them in English, we always say marshmallow. It's spelled marshmallow.
Mhm.
And there are references to these, like you said, many, many, many years ago. So I don't know enough about that sort of confection. I don't know the way in which it evolved and developed to what it is now. But I know that there are very old references to
Yeah.
mallows. So I don't know exactly what is involved there. And then you have a quintessential, the middle is the Hershey's chocolate. And so that's another kind of interesting component that's added in. So I agree. If you're not serving a marshmallow or a marshmallow as dessert for your camping site experience, then you're doing something wrong.
You have failed as a camper.
Right. Right. Undoubtedly. There's only really one way to fail, and that's the way. Now, you mentioned this earlier that there's a park in New York that, whose design I think that you helped to establish and now oversee. Maybe it's a different park. You mentioned the art park, but I think in the book you mentioned that there's another park. Just very briefly, maybe you can explain to us, how one goes about establishing a park. You kind of touched on that in a couple different ways, but maybe you can expand on that a little bit. And then I want to ask you, unconstrained by any financial or geographical or practical considerations, which you deal with all day as an architect, what would be your ideal park? What would it include? What sort of a picturesque background would it be set up against? Near what sort of body of water would it be situated? What would it be like?
Well, I think the structure, the facility I helped develop is located in an art park. It's about 104 acre, I think, sculpture park outside of Syracuse in Cazenovia, New York. It's a beautiful setting that has traditional kind of artworks that are sculptures around, but also a network of trails and a number of more contemporary art projects that are really dealing with the land and sort of larger spaces across the area of the park. So what I propose for 4 weekends every summer is this to turn some designated areas across the art park into a campground. And so all of the facilities I introduce into the project are all painted this really bright blue. So the picnic tables are bright blue. There's a number of other elements, kind of Adirondack chairs around the campfire. So you see them as a kind of this singular color, and you associate all of those elements together as a system that creates this so-called campground. But it only exists for a couple weekends every summer. So once the project concludes, all the stuff is moved into storage. So there's no permanent facility there. Which I think is really interesting in itself. As for the larger question, that's a really difficult one. I mean, to me, I think what's really interesting about what I've been exploring is both the similarity between the facilities themselves across the country, something that's facilitated by people like Albert Good. The kind of setting is quite similar, whether you're in Idaho or Maine or in Colorado. So there's a kind of standardization of that experience, but then juxtaposed against the idea of the broader landscape or the background where that experience is taking place. And so I like to think about place both in terms of the immediate setting, but also the broader setting as well. And it's the conflation of those that I think that makes it a really positive experience. If that makes sense. Like, it's both about the kind of interiority of the setting of the campground and then kind of where it is also. And both of those are meaningful. One is quite standardized, and then the other one is unique. It's where you are. I mean, we camped on Antelope Island in the middle of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It's an extraordinary place. Just the setting itself is magnificent. But when you look when I'm looking at the picnic table itself, while we're eating, contemplating the landscape, it itself is quite standard, right? So there's always a kind of juxtaposition of what's near and what's far that I always find really enjoyable when we go camping.
Yeah, in a certain way, it does reflect the America's motto, "E pluribus unum," out of many one. Out of many parks, there is a certain consistency, a thread that
Yeah,
links them all.
yeah.
So there I go again, sort of abstracting perhaps something that doesn't need to be abstracted. But Martin, I want to thank you again for being so generous with your time,
You're welcome.
joining me today and sharing all of this fascinating information. Again, I'll recommend that everybody goes out and gets a copy of this very fine book, Making Camp: A Visual History of Camping's Most Essential Items and Activities. Again, it enumerates the 8 features of which we all make use when we're at our camping sites, but very seldom recognize or think about. So your book is, I think, going to be very useful for thousands of campers going forward who are picking their lots and settling in for a good time. So let me ask you, Martin, before we depart, where can people find you if they want to follow you on social media or to contact you? Is there a platform of which they should make use?
I love to be on Instagram, so I've been posting about my book the last few months. So Hogue_Martin, that's always a good one, and of course, always happy to take people's emails and questions. So I think if you go, it's Martin Hogue, one word, at cornell.edu. That's always a good place too. But I'm always excited when people have questions or want to share some of their experiences. I think camping is one of those things that I think all of us have experienced in some ways, and it never fails during a Q&A on the book that people will automatically connect to one of their own personal experiences. And so it's a wonderful way to share our own humanity and experiences. And so that's one of the wonderful benefits of working on this topic.
Yeah, and I can say personally that I'm one of the beneficiaries of your willingness to reach out and talk with inquisitive minds who are looking to learn a little bit more about your work. Now, I think that was beautifully put. Do you have any other final messages with which you'd like to leave us?
I think not all campers are the same, and I think to acknowledge your own individuality in doing so, what our standards are, what our expectations are, and some people like to be in solitary, to head out on their own. Some others like to be surrounded by friends and family. I think that there's an incredible range here of possible experiences to be found, and we need to celebrate that.
I couldn't have put it better myself, and I would locate myself in the former camp, again, no pun intended, of the solitary adventurers who are going into nature alone. Martin, 1,000 thanks to you for agreeing to join me. My audience, small though you are, but growing and vigorous and vital, 1,000 thanks to you. Again, I encourage you all to share this episode with family, with friends, with enemies, with those with whom you hope to camp one day. I think that this information is indispensable. I love having these long, deep conversations, and I hope that you enjoy them as well. So with that, everyone out there, I bid thee farewell from Finneran's Wake. I'm Daniel Finneran, signing off. Thank you.